several of you, okay? But if you didn't, well, that's good, because you get it. But there, a lot of times, or several times, there's been a problem on questions 6 and 7 on Excel number 1. In questions 6 and 7, actually, I apologize, but I didn't even really realize that the author was not helping our cause here. But on question number 6, I think he says, use the frequency distribution, the one that you make, to estimate or approximate the mean. Right, everybody remember that question? I think it says estimate the mean. And question number 7, I think it says, do the same thing, but you're supposed to approximate or estimate what? The standard deviation. If both of those questions ring a bell? Now, the idea in 6 and 7 where you should use grouped data. Now, I don't know exactly what your classes were, so I will use mine just as an example here. But when I looked at the data, there was 50 data points, right? It was production of milk over 50 data points, and I think the low one was 1,147. The high might have been, what, about 4,285? I don't know if that rings a bell with anybody, but when I broke them up into different classes and I looked at it, you know, and I drew my frequency distribution, mine looked something like this. My first boundary was 999.5. That went up to 1499.5, the next boundary. Now, your boundaries might have been different. Don't get panic stricken if your boundaries are not these. I used this as the lower one so I could go up essentially by 500 each time. This was 2499.5. This is 2999.5. 3499.5. Guess I need a little more room. Let's see. Next one would have been 999. And this, I think my last one was 4499.5. Now, if your boundaries weren't exactly that, don't panic, okay? But if you had boundaries something like that, my frequency distribution looked something like this. I had 6 of the data points here. I had 10 here. I had 18 here. I had 11 here, 3, 1, and 1. 1 and 1. So yours might have been slightly different, but generally speaking, it should have looked like that. Now that's what my frequency distribution looked like. Now, before I did that, I could actually figure out the mean from all the data, the sample mean, by adding up all the data and dividing by 50, right? So if I add up all the data divided by 50, I got the sample mean. So my sample mean was, hopefully this number looks familiar to some people, 2270.5. That looks familiar to anybody? I don't see a lot of people shaking their head, but I think that is the sample mean. Derota's saying that's right, okay. The Cassidy said, you've seen that number before? Okay. And then sample standard deviation, I got 653.2. That look familiar to anybody? Ring a bell? Okay, so, and that was just from the data. In other words, it had nothing to do with the frequency distribution. That's just adding up the data, figuring out the mean, figuring out the sample standard deviation, and those are the two numbers, and I think they're correct. Now, in question number 6 and 7, it says, use the frequency distribution to estimate the mean and the standard deviation. So what's going on there? Well, that's when we talked about group data. Now, the reason I'm apologizing for the author, because he says, use the frequency distribution to estimate. Well, if you read the book closely, which I apologize, I didn't even read it this closely. Okay. But when he does talk about figuring the mean for group data, he says this is an approximation. This is not perfect because you're guessing that the data is right at the midpoints, okay? So, whoa, hi. So when he says estimate, the idea is to use the group data, calculate it. Don't just stand in the back of the room, okay, and say, oh, I estimate about, let's see here, with graduated eyeballs and say, okay, I got it. The idea here is to do it with group data. And when we figure out the mean for group data, what we did, X bar for group data, if you recall, and again I'll use mine as an example, the midpoint of that first category for me was 1249.5. The next midpoint was 1749.5. If we didn't know where the data was, we assumed that all 6 of them were right at the midpoint. Or all 10 of them are right at the midpoint. So that's not really where the data was, but that's the best we can do if we're just looking at the picture. So when we figured out the mean from group data, we had to say, all right, well, I'm going to take the midpoint times the frequency. So there were 6 observations, for example, in my case, of 1249.5. This midpoint times the frequency. And there were 10 observations of 1749.5, and I did that all the way up for every class, and I added them all up. Now, that essentially is the sum of the midpoints times the frequency. Midpoint times as many times as it occurs. And then I divided that by n. So if I added all these up, in my case, and divided by n, I got the approximate mean based just on the picture. Does that ring a bell with anybody? We talked about this a little bit before. Now, based on my distribution, in my picture, my frequency distribution, the mean for the grouped data I got 2269.5. Now that, again, this should be the same for everybody. But your group data mean might be slightly different because you might have slightly different classes and midpoint in mind. But that, how far it was off, not much, okay, like 1 point. Questions? Make sense? How many people did that? Good job. Good job. Cassie, did that kind of raise your hand, or you're not sure, or you did that, or what? I mean,
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, Chelsea?
Just double checking, but and on the bottom, that would be 50, right?
Yeah, okay, yeah. So let me just put the N up there, and for us, you're absolutely right. N here is 50. Okay? Now, carry that same idea forward to the idea of figuring out the standard deviation. And there's no real quick way to do this other than just keep building these columns, okay? But if you recall, when we figured out standard deviation, I'm just going to go over here. We said we need to figure out the variance, and the variance was equal to all of these observations minus the mean squared, how far away each observation is from the mean, we squared it, and we added them all up, and we divided by what? Not n, but n minus 1. Remember that? We took 1 off. And that was the variance. That was the sample variance. And we said that was denoted by s squared. And we got the sample standard deviation how? How did we get from s squared to s? We took the square root. And we took the square root of whatever this number was, this whole thing, took the square root, and we got s, the sample standard deviation. But it was about how far away each piece of data was from the middle. So you take that idea, and of course there was a couple examples in the book, but over here, we're doing the same thing. But again, we don't know, we don't have the data, so we see how far each midpoint away from the middle they are. And so if I do that over here, I say, all right, let me take a midpoint. And there's going to be, depending on how many classes you have, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7 midpoints. For each midpoint, I say, how far away are you from this number, the group data, the mean? And I say, all right, well, remember we squared it because we didn't want to lose positive and negative and stuff, so we square it. But I got to do that how many times? I have to do it for this midpoint over here. I have to do that, multiply it by 6, because there's 6 observations that are that distance away from the midpoint. So I got to multiply that times the frequency, and I'll put a C down here for the class, but I take the midpoint of the class, multiply it times the frequency of the class when I get that distance measure. How many people did I lose? Totally checked out. Okay. So everybody understand this is just how far away the midpoint is from the middle, right? Well, where was the midpoint? 22, group data 22 to 69. Right about in here. 22 to 69.5. So I say, okay, well that midpoint is that minus that away. I take that, I square it, but I have to do it 6 times because I got these 6 mysterious occurrences right in that class. Well, I do that for every midpoint in every class. Add them all up. I can get over here. Divide by what? Same thing, right? I got 49, well, 50 minus 1, right? And minus 1. And then I have the sample variance from the group data, or using the midpoints. Now, when I did that, I got an answer of, oh, and I apologize, this is s squared, and then I take the square root of that and I get s. So I have to take the square root of this. I can put a big square root sign over there if you want to get s. So I guess I don't want to confuse your notes, but that's s squared. So take the square root of s squared. That equals s. And the number I got was 646.5. And so I am comparing this, which is what I got from group data, with what? that right there, that I got from the pure data. Anybody follow me, other than me? So the good news is that the whole Excel assignment was with 8 points. So you're not gonna, get clobbered. Your life is not gonna end if you didn't get that part of the problem right. You'll lose maybe a point or something like that. The bad news is I'm gonna put something like this on the test. Okay? Question? I mean, I'm gonna say, draw a histogram, give me the mean before you draw the histogram, and then give me the mean for group data and the standard deviation for group data. Yeah?
Are you gonna put like something like question from 1 to 8? Or is it just gonna be like something like this?
I'm not sure. There'll be something like this on the test,
Okay.
yes. But the test is gonna cover all of chapters 1 and 2. But the answer specifically, yeah, there'll be a small data set that you're gonna have to work with on the test. I mean, not exclusively, there'll be other questions too, but yes. Question? How many people are
And
depressed?
I'm gonna have to do histograms by hand
Yeah.
during the test.
Yeah, you might, in fact, it's probably a good idea if you bring a little straight edge, a little ruler, or, put some tape on the side of your note card so you can use it to draw a straight line, that would probably be helpful or something like that, okay? So how many people are depressed? Okay, so I can't help the depression. But if you have questions, I can help maybe alleviate some of the anxiety if you answer the question. Okay? Just take drugs if you're depressed.
Prescription drugs.
Prescription, I apologize, I'm gonna get a lot of trouble here. Okay, so in the next hour or so, I would like to move away from this. I want to talk about chapter 3, which is probability. Can I erase this? I mean, I can leave it up for a minute if you want.